Jon from Japanese Knife Imports, and today I'm here to talk to you about KnifePlanet's knife sharpening school that we've been doing for lesson number 3, which we're going to talk about thinning your knives. It's a kind of important process that we all go through, but it seems to confuse a lot of our customers, and so Peter and I thought it would be really useful to make a video that explains a little bit about why we thin, how to approach thinking about thinning, and also how to make things look nice when we're done thinning. So, why do we thin our knives? Over time, as we use our knives, we get into the thicker sections of the blade as we go. So imagine this is your blade. We sharpen and we get up into these thicker sections. And as we get into the thicker sections of the blade, the knife starts to move through food differently. Because it's thicker behind the edge, it tends to wedge a little bit more, it tends to get stuck in food a little bit more, and it tends to cause food to crack or break a little bit more. So what we want to do is we want to keep our knife cutting kind of the way that it was cutting when it was brand new. And part of the reason that our knives cut so well when they're brand new is that they're really thin behind the edge. So we need a way to regain control over how thick or thin our knife is behind the edge. So when you look at your knife, you can sight down here looking at the choil area over here. You can get a sense of how thick or thin the knife is. This particular one is on the thicker side of things. And so you can see that it gets really thick really quickly right after the edge over here. This means that as I cut with this knife, it's going to get stuck in food a lot more. It's going to wedge. It's not going to cut the way that we want. So we need a way to regain control over how our knife cuts. And the way that we do that is by sharpening on the sides of the blade up here, not just at the edge, but the actual sides of the blade. And by doing this, we're able to regain control over how thick or thin our knife is behind the edge. The thinner that we go with it, the more easily that it will move through food with less resistance, but the more fragile or brittle the knife is likely to be. The less thin that we go with it, the more tough and durable the knife is going to be, but the less easily it's going to move through food. We also need to keep in mind that as we thin the knives, we may increase the amount of food stickage that occurs. Now, there are a lot of kinds of knives that we end up thinning. There are some that are wide bevels, like this, where the thinning is kind of built into the process, and it's really easy to keep these looking nice because of that. There are other knives like this one, which is a little bit scratched up as I got prepared for this thinning class, but there's no guide, there's no wide bevel. It's just kind of a free form thinning that we'll have to do on this kind of thing. And on these, it's a little bit more complicated to keep them looking nice, but we still need to do the same kinds of thinning processes to it to keep the knife cutting well. As you go about thinning, keep in mind that the more acute that you go with your thinning bevel overall, the sharper the knife is going to feel, and the more impact that you're going to have overall on the cross-sectional geometry of the knife. The less acute that you go, the less significant impact you're going to have on the way that your knife interacts with food, moves through food. So when we go about thinning, I often tell people you want to be thinning at least about 1/3 of the way up the blade, if not more. Oftentimes when we thin for our customers, when we have stuff in for knife sharpening services, we'll thin about 1/3 or halfway up the blade, and then our refinishing process, making everything look pretty again, will end up taking care of the rest of the blade and keeping it all nice and thin all together. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do for thinning. I'm going to show you the thinning process on some wide bevel stuff, on some not wide bevel stuff, and I'm going to go through a little bit of what we're going to do for refinishing our knives. So let's start here with this wide bevel knife, because these are kind of easy to do. It's built in, and so it's really easy to see what you want to be doing. There's a number of ways that you can sharpen wide bevel knives, and so depending on how you're going about sharpening your wide bevel knife, you may or may not need to think about thinning as a separate process. It might already be part of what you do. But if you're using a knife like this and just sharpening it like a regular knife at whatever angle, 10 to 15 degrees per side that you're doing, then thinning is going to be important. If you are using the wide bevel like a hamaguri edge, which is similar to the way that single bevel knives are sharpened, or you do a flat grind all the way to the edge, well then you're already thinning as you go. Here you can see it's about 1/3 of the way up the blade. Our thinning angles tend to be significantly lower than our sharpening angles. So if our sharpening angle is way up here, our thinning angle is going to be a much lower angle way down here. And for a lot of people, that ends up being somewhere between 2 and maybe 5 degrees or so. I measure every once in a while, but it's not so important that you're measuring. It's more important that you're doing something consistently and you can see that you're getting consistent and even results. Again, on the wide bevel stuff, it's kind of built in, so you can feel, almost click in to where you want to be for the bevel. You can see that the knife clicks depending on where I'm pressing on it. So here we go. I'm going to try and enact some change over here. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my blade. I'm going to see how thick or thin the knife is behind the edge. This will give me an idea of about how much thinning I want to do. And if you're having trouble seeing things, or if you feel like seeing only tells you one part of the story, which it does here at the heel, you can use your fingers and run them up across the blade this way. So not towards the edge, but I'll pinch the blade and I'll slide my fingers over and away from the edge. And this gives me a tactile sense of how thick or thin the knife is behind the edge. Of course, cutting food will also give you a good idea of how thick or thin your knife feels. But this gives me a starting point where I know about how much thinning I want to do. So as I get ready to do that, I'm going to put the knife on the stone, keep it at this low angle, and start to do my sharpening. Now here I'm using a 400 grit stone. When I do thinning for customers, we use as coarse of a stone as we can find. So oftentimes we use stones that are even coarser than this, 220 grit, or if we use our water wheel, it's about 120 grit. We use something like that to move metal much more quickly. When you're doing this at home, if you're doing this for the first time, you might not want to use something as aggressive as a 220 grit stone, and so something in that 400 to 600 grit range will work well. If you're very diligent about thinning your knife, you can get away with using a medium grit stone to do that thinning. But once you kind of move past that point, you're not really removing enough metal to have any serious impact on cross-sectional geometry. So it is something that is more coarse work than fine work. So go as coarse as you feel comfortable doing. So here we are, doing all the same kinds of things we would do for sharpening, just at a much lower angle. So even as I come up to the tip, I still have to lift up and adjust towards the spine as I make my tip adjustment. And so here you can see we're having an impact on the side of the knife, and you can see here there's still some of the residual bevel from where we had been sharpening as we sharpen this kind of like a normal double bevel knife here at the edge. As we thin, we have a few different metrics that we can use to help us gauge where we are. One of them obviously is looking and seeing how thick or thin it is, as we discussed before. Another is feeling, as we discussed before. But one of the really important visual feedbacks that we get is how the size of our bevel reduces over time as we're doing our thinning. We want to make sure that the size of the bevel is reducing evenly and consistently from heel to tip. That tells me that I'm doing an even job at thinning the knife and that I'm removing roughly the same amount of metal in each place along the blade and keeping it somewhat even as I go. So I can look and see at the bevel, is this getting smaller at the same rate that this area is getting smaller, and is it getting smaller at the same rate that this is getting smaller? And that gives me a good idea of how much thinning I want to do and how evenly and consistently I'm doing this. As you do your thinning, keep in mind that you can always remove more metal, but you can't put metal back on. And so I often recommend to people, as you do thinning, go slow. Thin a little bit, then use your knife and see how it works. And if you're happy with it, great. And if you're not, go back and thin a little bit more. So here, we've done a little bit more work. The bevel is much smaller, and it's reducing in size somewhat evenly and consistently all the way through. Now, for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm not going to go through and do everything in the full time-consuming way that I would normally do this, but keep in mind that thinning takes time. You can't rush this process, and it might take you 30 minutes, and it might take you more, depending on what kind of condition your knife is in, and also how much time you want to spend in refinishing things and making things look pretty. The beauty of wide bevels is that as we go through this process and say I finished my thinning on my coarse stone, I can then go through a progression using medium grit stones and finishing stones. So I'm going to use a medium grit stone here for a second to give you guys an idea. And I can just use normal sharpening to refinish my knife and make it look pretty. And so you can see here that it's starting to come together. It has nice contrast, the edge is shiny, everything looks really pretty, and that's good. This means that not only have we done a decent job at thinning, but we're also keeping it nice and consistent and even with regard to scratch patterns and refining consistently and evenly. So wide bevels make it a lot easier to do. So that's kind of how the wide bevels would work. And the same thing would happen on the opposite side as you go through your thinning. You'll start at a much lower angle, and you'll work your way through paying attention to how it feels cross-sectionally, how it looks cross-sectionally, and also how the bevel size that's at the edge reduces. So that's the wide bevel stuff. Here I have something that's not a wide bevel knife. And so I'm going to show you what happens when we do stuff to knives that don't have a wide bevel and how we have to deal with those. So I'm going to go back to my coarse stone here for a second. And here, I don't have any guide that tells me where I want to be. So as I'm sharpening, I'm going to have to make a decision for myself of how far up I want to thin the blade, what angle is going to be appropriate for me. Now, of course, you can always use Sharpie, and you can color in the blade and see what's going on. And of course, acetone and some cotton pads will help with removing that when you're done. But that gives you a really high contrast, instant visual feedback as to where you are doing your thinning. But it's not going to look as pretty, unfortunately, on blades like this. So I've picked a relatively low angle, somewhere in like the 3 to 4 degree range. And now I'm doing my thinning. So as I thin here, you can see I'm making an impact about 1/3 of the way up the blade, so all through this section over here. But there's a lot of scratching, and it's not as even and consistent. In fact, there's some waviness to this, and it's because the sides of the knives aren't necessarily perfectly flat. There's always some kind of grind waviness or grind inconsistencies that occur. And I have yet to see a knife where that's not the case. So keep in mind that it may not look as perfect on stuff like this, and that's okay. It just means it's going to take us a little bit more time and effort in the refinishing process to keep things looking nice. Now, you don't have to refinish blades when you thin them. It's just that a lot of people like their knives to look really pretty because we spend a lot of time and money with our tools, and we take pride in how they are. So on knives like this, when we're done thinning, we can go through a progression, working our way up from coarse to medium to fine, but it's still not going to look even and consistent. So the way that we would refinish this is different from the way that we would deal with a wide bevel. For knives like that, we would get a nice flat surface, and we would put something down, and we would secure the blade. And then following the scratch pattern that exists already on the blade, we would take some wet dry sandpaper in whatever the grit is that's closest to the grit that you were using for your sharpening, or even slightly coarser than that, and some kind of soft foam backing. And we would use something like this, rubbing along in the same way that the scratch pattern already runs on the blade. And we can work through a progression of this wet dry sandpaper all the way through until we get to a finish that looks consistent and even and is appealing to us visually and aesthetically. It's not important as far as cutting performance goes. It's just about making stuff look pretty again. And so you can go through that process and refinish your knife, and then when you're done refinishing it, you can go through and do your normal sharpening. When you do thinning, it's going to be the process that you do before you do your sharpening. So you're not going to sharpen your knife and then thin it. You're going to thin it first, possibly refinish it if you feel the need to do so, and then sharpen it. If you do the sharpening first, the thinning process is likely to mess up the edge in the process. There's a lot of abrasive, a lot of mud, and depending on how far you go with the thinning, you may actually end up hitting the edge in some cases. So as I mentioned before, we're looking for the bevel size to reduce evenly and consistently. For knives where you go for more extreme thinning, where you're trying to really have a serious impact on the way the knife moves through food, you may thin until the bevel is entirely gone, until you've thinned all the way into a flat grind, I guess what some people would call like a zero grind essentially, where you just sharpen all the way down to the edge. And in those cases, the knife is going to be a lot thinner, but you won't have that visual feedback to guide you to where you want to be. So keep in mind that that's also something possible to do. Anyways, this has been our little talk on thinning. I hope that this has been helpful for you guys. And of course, feel free to bug us with any follow-up questions that you might have about thinning, about how it works, about what you want to be doing in terms of refinishing, if that's something you're interested in, what stones might work well. We should have a blog that goes together with this, and Peter will be working on that. And we really hope that you're enjoying these classes. So thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.